AIMU, the American Institute of Marine Underwriters, is proud to present a guide to cargo insurance. This is part 2, Incoterms, how they work. My name is Keith Carey of Simplicitas, and I'll be your instructor. But first, let's have a word from our lawyers. Here's our standard disclaimer. This guide is meant solely to provide information. AIMU does not represent, warrant, covenant, nor guarantee the truthfulness or accuracy of any statement contained herein. This guide does not constitute legal advice. Readers should consult an attorney if legal advice is desired. AIMU wishes to underscore the importance of compliance with the laws of the United States. The laws prohibit members, while engaged in AIMU activities, from entering into any discussions or matters affecting rates or conditions of insurance contracts, other than promulgation of standard forms or wordings for voluntary use in the industry. It is the policy of the AIMU to honor and abide by these prohibitions in all respects. Whew, that's a lot of words. Now let's get down to the business at hand. We all know that the world is a big place, and this can make the world of international commerce a challenge. Let's say that we have a seller in China, and they want to send their goods to a buyer in South America. But before they can complete their transaction, they have to define the terms of sale, which could include payment for transit, payment of import and export duties, transfer of risk, and purchase of insurance. And just to make things a little more complicated, the buyer
¿Cuánto cuesta?
and the seller
Wash out, Chad.
do not speak the same language. This is why the International Chamber of Commerce, or the ICC, developed the International Commercial Terms, otherwise known as Incoterms. These are a series of predefined commercial terms that are widely used in international commerce to bridge the gap. These rules are stated as three-letter terms that relate to common contractual sales practices. Incoterms are generally accepted by governments, legal authorities, and practitioners worldwide for the implementation of the most commonly used terms in international trade. The rules are intended to clearly communicate the tasks, costs, and risks associated with the transportation and delivery of goods. Historically, there have been 8 different versions of the Incoterms. They were first published in 1936, but 2010 is the most recent version, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. These were published on January 1st of 2011. This 2010 version defines 11 different rules, which are subdivided into 2 different categories based on method of delivery. The first 7 rules define terms for any mode of transportation. Typically, these rules would be used with containerized goods. The final 4 rules are primarily used for sea and inland waterway transport, and these would typically be used for bulk or break bulk type shipments. So let's look at how these rules would be used in a normal transaction. In most cases, you would have a seller and you would have a buyer. And the seller's goal would be to get their goods to the buyer. But between them could be many different things. There's sea, there's land, there could be borders to cross. Also, it could be movements on trucks, deliveries to marine terminals, voyages on vessels, transport by plane, transport by train, or storage in warehouses. And these are just a few examples of some of the different circumstances that could encounter goods in transit. It's clear to see why it must be fully defined exactly who is responsible at each point during the transit. Let's now look at our first set of rules for the Incoterms. These are 7 rules that would be used for any mode of transportation. All Incoterm rules are written as three-letter designations followed by a dash and then the location to which the goods are to be delivered. So our first term is EXW, our X works, and that would be written EXW dash named place of delivery. Now in many cases this would be the seller's location, meaning that the buyer would pick up the goods from the seller. The seller would make these goods available at its premises and its duties would end there. This term places the maximum amount of obligation on the buyer and the minimum amount of obligation on the seller. Our next term is FCA, our free carrier, and this would be followed by a named place of delivery. In this case, the seller hands over the goods cleared for export into the disposal of the first carrier, and this carrier would be named by the buyer at a named place. The seller pays for carriage to the named point of delivery, and the risk passes when the goods are handed over to the first carrier. So in this case, the seller might transport the goods to a freight forwarder or another third party that would take control of the goods in the name of the buyer and then transport the goods to the final destination. The seller has an additional responsibility in that they have to clear these goods for export out of the country in which they were manufactured. But the buyer still has the primary responsibility to make sure that the goods arrive at their final destination. Our next term is CPT, our carriage paid to, with a named place of destination stated. In this case, the seller pays for carriage to a specified destination. However, the risk still transfers to the buyer upon handing over the goods to the first carrier. So even though the seller is the one responsible for arranging transportation, possibly to a warehouse or to another location specified by the buyer still has the primary responsibility for the risk during transit. Additionally, the buyer still retains any risk or any financial exposure that they might have to import duties when bringing it into their country. CIP is our next term. This is defined as carriage and insurance paid, and this would be to a named place of destination. This is very similar to CPT, that is carriage paid to, except that the seller in this case not only pays for the carriage, but also pays for the insurance to the named destination point. However, it's important for the buyer to note that the risk still passes to the buyer when the goods are handed over to the first carrier. So even though the insurance is being bought by the seller really has no financial risk in those goods being moved if they have been fully paid at that time. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the buyer to make sure that the insurance provided by the seller will be able to stand up to any risk to which the merchandise is exposed over the course of transit. With our next three terms, the location at which the risk changes hands begins to be different. DAT, our delivered at terminal, would list a named terminal at a port or place of destination. In this case, the seller would pay for carriage to the terminal, and except for the cost related to import clearance, would assume all risk up to the point that the goods are unloaded at the terminal. So in this case, it would be the seller that would want to make sure that they have adequate insurance because they have a much greater risk during the course of transit. Our next term adds even more risk to the seller. DAP, our delivered at place, would include a named place of destination. In this case, the seller would pay for carriage to this named place, which would be beyond the terminal location, meaning that this could include inland transit as well. The seller would pay for all costs except for the cost related to import clearance, and they would assume all risk prior to the point that the goods are ready for unloading by the buyer. Our last term in these 7 terms for all modes of transit is really the most onerous for the seller. This is DDP, our delivered duty paid, and that would include a named place of destination. In this case, the seller is not only responsible for delivering the goods to the named place in the country of the buyer, he would also pay all costs that would be associated with bringing the goods into that country and transporting it to its final destination, including duties and taxes. Let's now move from these 7 rules that would work for all modes of transport to the 4 rules that are based primarily for sea and inland waterways. The first would be FAS, our free alongside, and this would include a named port of shipment. In this case, the seller must place the goods alongside the ship at the named port. At this point, the risk would transfer to the buyer. The seller, though, must clear the goods for export. Our next term is probably the most commonly known because it's the most commonly used. FOB, our free on board, includes a named port of shipment. In this case, the seller must load the goods on board the vessel nominated by the buyer. Risk transfers when the goods are actually on board the vessel. The seller must also clear the goods for export. At first glance, it might appear that there is little difference between FAS, our free alongside, and FOB, free on board. However, the main difference is that the seller retains risk while the goods are being transported aboard the vessel. This does greatly increase the risk exposure for the seller. Our next term is also very commonly known. This is CIF, our cost, insurance, and freight, and this would include a named port of destination. In this case, the seller must pay the costs, freight, and insurance to bring the goods to the port of destination. However, risk is transferred to the buyer once the goods are loaded on the vessel. It's interesting that this is very closely related to CIP that we discussed in the previous rules. And the same thought process would apply for the buyer in this case as well. They would want to make sure that the seller's insurance would be able to cover them for all the risks that the merchandise could be exposed to during the course of transit. Our final term is CFR, our cost and freight, and that would include a named port of destination. This is very similar to CIF, our cost, insurance, and freight. The only difference is that in this case, the seller is not required to purchase insurance for the transit. However, the seller must still pay the cost and freight to bring the goods to the port of destination. Again, the risk is transferred to the buyer once the goods are loaded on the vessel. That's the basic review of Incoterms 2010. But for insurance professionals, our question would be, who should buy insurance? Well, it's not as easily defined as you might think after reviewing the Incoterms. While the party required to purchase insurance is defined in these terms, it is common for exporters to control the placing or arranging of cargo insurance on a warehouse-to-warehouse basis. And at certain times, buyers might purchase insurance even though the exporters actually have their own insurance policy. Why would this be the case? Well, let's look at each component. We have the seller, and we have the buyer. The buyer may not be in the business of import and export, so the seller may secure insurance on their behalf. The seller, on the other hand, may still have a financial interest in the goods being shipped and may want to retain their insurance. So what about the buyer? Well, the buyer may see that the seller is charging an inflated rate for the insurance that they are providing. Additionally, they could view the seller's insurance as providing a very limited coverage, so it would be in their best interest to have their own policy of insurance. Some buyers might even have an opportunity to purchase insurance for better terms than what they're currently receiving from some of their trade partners. We hope you've enjoyed our brief review of Incoterms 2010. As a reminder, this is presented by the AIMU, or the American Institute of Marine Underwriters. Please check them out at www.aimu.org. There you can find more resource information along with the rest of this series. Also, this is being presented by Simplicitask LLC. My name is Keith Carey, and this is one of 4 presentations that we've done for the AIMU. Please check out the others on aimu.org.
¿Cuánto cuesta? 多少钱?